Last fall, I got to celebrate the joy of killing my first elk with a bow. And it was pretty exciting. Thank you to my lovely daughter for bringing me my Bible that I left at the Welcome Center. Kind of hard to preach without it. It was a really great experience up until the realization that I had hundreds of pounds of meat on the ground now in front of me, and I was still a mile and a half from camp. And so my 74-year-old father, my 18-year-old daughter, and myself packed this entire elk out in one trip. Now, before you get all excited and think that we're some kind of He-Man, it just tells you how small the elk was. My dad took the two front shoulders, and my daughter took out all the boned meat, and then I took out everything that was left. And as we hiked back to camp, all in one trip, we walked into camp, and there was another camper that had pulled in near us, just pulled in that morning. And of course, when they saw that we were packing an elk out, they got pretty excited, and they came out of their camper and they were high-fiving us, and they wanted to, of course, hear the story, which normally I would be very excited to tell the story of my first successful elk hunt with a bow. But I had been carrying meat on my back for a mile and a half. And it's interesting, after 10 minutes of conversation, feels like an hour when you've still got all that weight on your back, and you've had that weight on your back for a long time. And I just had to call a timeout in the middle of all their questions and wanting to talk to us about it and hear the story. And I said, listen, I don't mean to be rude, but I got to get this weight off my back. It's kind of getting heavy. Of course, they graciously let me go. And when I got back to camp, I took the pack off. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this. When you take a weight off of your back, what happens to you when you try to walk? It was kind of a stumble forward sort of a thing. And the difference is I had made an adjustment for how I was balancing myself because of the weight that I was carrying. Now, a lot of us come into church today carrying a burden like that. And you've coped with it for a long time, and you've figured out how to walk to counterbalance the burden that you carry. And we all carry one. I was so used to the extreme pressure. Some of us come in here today like that, feeling like life is crushing you spiritually and emotionally. The question is, how important is it to share that burden with other people? That's why we have life groups and recovery groups and men's and women's ministries and Bible studies where people know and are known on a deeper level, and they share the burdens of life with other people. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but when you share that burden with somebody else, it doesn't change the burden. It doesn't fix the problem. But for some reason, when you share it with somebody else, it gets a little lighter. You walk differently. The Bible says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And we do that week in and week out in our small groups and Bible studies. Today's story, we're going to see how Jesus, carrying the weight of the world, how did he deal with it? Because it's not just follow Jesus to the cross, it's follow Jesus' example. And this night, over and above any other night in Jesus' life, he is carrying a burden unbelievably heavy, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 39. We've come to the story in the crucifixion story here. We've come to the part of Gethsemane. Luke 22, beginning in verse 39, says this: Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives. His disciples followed him. And on reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not enter into temptation." He withdrew a stone's throw beyond them, knelt, and prayed, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And when he arose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked. Get up and pray, that you will not fall into temptation. After Jesus had finished eating the Last Supper, the Passover meal with his disciples, they sung a hymn, probably one of the Psalms, and they left the house, they left Jerusalem, and they went out east of the city, across the Kidron Valley, down into the Kidron, back up the other side, onto the Mount of Olives, opposite the city. And if Jesus were trying to avoid capture, I want you to notice in verse 39, it says something interesting. Verse 39 says, Jesus went out as usual. If Jesus, knowing that Judas was betraying him, if he was trying to avoid capture, he wouldn't go to where he normally would go. And what this shows us is that Jesus is in control this entire event. He's in control the entire time. He knows what's going to happen to him, and he submits to it. As the name suggests, the Mount of Olives, of course, is covered with olive groves. And Jesus entered one of those olive groves where there was a garden. That garden is called the Garden of Gethsemane. At the base of the Mount of Olives today, there's a church at the traditional place where Jesus takes his disciples and prayed on this final night of his life. Church is called the Church of All Nations. You can see it in the picture there, Church of All Nations. It's the third church that's been built on this site. It was finished in 1924, and there were churches that have been built on that site since even a little bit before Constantine. So this is a fairly early attested site to where Jesus' Garden of Gethsemane actually was. By the way, in 2024, I get that right, we're going to be making a trip to Israel, and this is one of the sites that we visit. We go to the Garden of Gethsemane, to the Church of All Nations, and if you go inside that church, not only has it got incredible architecture, but there's a spot at the front of the church near the altar where the priests and the preachers perform their services. There's a rock that is not part of the marble floor. There's a rock that stands above the floor, and that is the traditional rock where Jesus supposedly knelt to the ground and prayed. And you can walk right up to it, and it's surrounded with this encroaching steel vine, overhanging olive trees, and the paintings and the architecture, and they give it a very suffocating feel to replicate this darkest moment in history. Church sits on the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane has several olive trees in it still to this day. As a matter of fact, the whole hillside has quite a few olive trees. But the interesting thing about these olive trees is there are 8 olive trees, like the one in this picture. There are 8 of these oldest olive trees in the garden that date clear back to the 12th century A.D. Now, all 8 of these trees in Gethsemane share a common single parent tree that these trees were cut and propagated from. And I can't help but wonder if Christians throughout history have recognized this as the Garden of Gethsemane and cut shoots and saplings off of the original olive trees that Jesus may have even knelt next to or leaned up against. And all 8 of these olive trees have the same DNA. They're cut from the same tree. This was the place where Jesus prayed in agony. Was this the place where drops of holy sweat and blood fell so long ago? Gethsemane. 2 Hebrew words. Gat, meaning press, and shemen, meaning oil. Hence the name oil press. It was in an olive grove, and you got to know a little bit about olives, so let me explain. They're harvested for oil, but the process is pretty labor intensive. After the olives are picked, They're dumped into a stone basin, pits and all, and then a donkey pushes a horizontal beam which rolls a giant millstone over these olives and crushes them. Crushes them into a mash. Now, Isaiah 53, the passage of prophecy 700 years before Jesus is born, tells us of the suffering servant. And one of the things it says about him is that he was crushed for our iniquities. He was crushed. Well, when those olive pits are crushed, the mash is then scooped up and is put into porous baskets, and it's put into an olive press like the one you're going to see on the screen right now. There's an olive press that they're pushed into, not that one. Go back to the previous one. Here's the olive press right here. Now you can see the olive press. Underneath the stone are those mesh bags, and on the end of a fulcrum, there are weights that are put on that press. Now, how many of you have purchased virgin olive oil to cook with or whatever? Yeah, virgin olive oil. The reason it's called virgin olive oil is because olives are not pressed just once. They're pressed once with a certain amount of weight on them, and then they are added weight to them, and they're pressed again, and then they are added more weight to it and pressed again. They're pressed not once, not twice, but 3 times. And if you read the other gospel accounts, Luke doesn't bring this detail forward, but Matthew, Mark, and John all say that Jesus went away from his disciples in the olive press and he prayed how many times? Father, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And 3 times he went back to his disciples and he found them asleep. And Jesus is in the olive press. Next picture. Gospel of Luke. Now, granted, these few verses are not in any of the other Gospels, and as a matter of fact, a lot of your Bibles will have brackets around the verse 43 and 44 of Luke 22. They'll have brackets around it because they're not in the oldest and best manuscripts. However, the truth remains, this is what olives look like when they're being pressed. Luke 22, verse 43 and 44 says that Jesus prayed again, this time in great anguish, and his sweat became like what? Drops of blood falling to the ground. Jesus is under extreme pressure. And it wasn't just once, not just twice, but 3 times. In Matthew and Mark's version of the story, Jesus tells his disciples, "My soul is distressed even to the point of death." Nevertheless, the agony and the pressure that this picture points to would be expected, considering the situation. So here in the olive press, Jesus bore the weight of the sin of the world, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Like olive oil under pressure is squeezed out, flows into the pit of an olive press. It's the extreme pressure, the pressure of the cross, specifically as it pertained to bearing the sin of the world. To give you some sort of an idea of this, people have nervous breakdowns, don't we? We have nervous breakdowns, and a lot of times it's over trauma done to us, or it's over trauma we've inflicted on somebody else, or we've borne the weight of our shame and our sin, just like I carried that elk, and it changes the way that we move. It changes the way we cope with life. Now imagine that not only your shameful events, but every person in this room's shameful events were piled on you, and then times that by all the people that have ever lived in human history and all that will continue to live for as long as the Lord tarries, and you can imagine the weight that Jesus felt as he looked ahead to the cross. This is the moment that Jesus' command to pray is undoubtedly both for his sake and for his disciples' sake. And he said to his disciples, "Pray with me so that you won't fall into temptation." When you're overwhelmed, feel like you're carrying the weight of the world, follow Jesus. And Jesus' example in the olive press teaches us this. Here's the application. When life feels like an olive press and you're down in the midst of it, do what Jesus did. Jesus' way of dealing with the pressure of the weight of the world was to go to the Father in prayer and to ask other people to join him in that prayer. As Jesus wrestled in the garden, his wrestling match was a wrestling match against his self-will. Think about it for a moment. Here we have a temptation of the self-will in a garden. Where have we heard this before? Where have we heard the story about temptation of self-will in a garden? Adam and Eve, right? That happened in a garden too. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, Paul calls Jesus the last Adam. Adam too struggled with temptation in a garden. What was God's revealed will at the time? From the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you must not eat or you will surely die. God's will was, don't eat from the tree. My will was, it looks amazing. Maybe I should try it. How many of you, when you see a sign that says don't touch wet paint, you got to do it, right? You got to test it and just see. I've found that my toughest battles are not with Satan. They're not with God. They're with who? Self-will. If Calvary's cross was the crucifixion of Jesus' body, Gethsemane is the crucifixion of his will. And he could not go to the cross until he had first experienced the olive press of Gethsemane. Here we have Jesus praying to the Father through blood, sweat, and tears. Father, if there's any way, if there's any other method of redemption for humanity, I don't want to go through this, Lord. Two men tempted in a garden. One failed and brought sin and death to all. The other succeeds and brings holiness and life to all. That's what Romans chapter 5, verse 19 says. For just as through the disobedience of one man the many were made sinners, so also the obedience of one man, the many will be made righteous. Jesus said, I don't want to go through it. Nevertheless, not my will, but whose? Your will be done. The School of Gethsemane is the school of self-denial. Richard Foster, in his book on prayer, writes this. He says, to applaud the will of God, to do the will of God, even to fight for the will of God is not difficult until what? It comes at cross purposes with my will. That's where things get difficult. My will and thy will are almost always at odds with each other, and when they are, I cannot do thy will and my will at the same time. Thy will doesn't promote my self-interest. My will has to be conquered by God's will. And I want to say to you this morning that relinquishing your self-will in favor of God's will is the most difficult part of following after Jesus. The Garden of Gethsemane is a place we all go, right? We all feel the intense pressure, the burden that life throws at us. Follow Jesus' example and say, not my will, but thy will be done. In verse 47, the moment that Jesus has come to the Olive Garden for takes place. And while he was still speaking, a crowd came up. And the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The one was Peter. But Jesus answered, no more of this. He touched the man's ear and healed him. And then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. From Jesus' vantage point at the base of the Mount of Olives, he would have been able, and to this day, from the Church of All Nations in the Garden of Gethsemane, you can see the entire hill to the west, below the Temple Mount. And there's a road that comes down the hill into the Kidron Valley. And Jesus would have been able to see his captors coming towards him from at least a half a mile away. Theologians debate, but it could be anywhere from 200 to 1,000 people came to arrest Jesus. The scripture says they came with clubs and with swords and with torches. How visible would they have been? How much noise would 200 to 1,000 people coming down the hillside make? Jesus knew they were coming, and he was in total control of it. And if ever Jesus wanted to get out of the suffering of the cross, he could have fled the Garden of Gethsemane, but he chose not to. He chose not to. And the only thing that gave him the power to make that decision, to resist that testing, was his prayer. Prayer is the key. He's in full control of everything. And I'm sure everything in him wanted to run and to save his own life. But staying in the garden was because it was the Father's will. And it meant ultimately his death. The other gospel writers say that Judas had prearranged the signal with the crowd, that the one I kiss is the one to arrest. And in the darkness of the mixed crowd, it would not be easy to know which one was Jesus. And so Judas went up and kissed Jesus. And it's a crazy irony that it is a typical Middle Eastern greeting between close friends that betrays the Lord of glory. I want you to see a contrast in this story. Because Jesus' full knowledge of everything that's taking place. His disciples, as Keith just mentioned a few minutes ago, they're not getting it. Clearly, they're not understanding. Jesus' full control, his knowledge, his willingness, and his submission to the Father's will versus the disciples as exemplified in Peter's actions. The disciples, realizing what was about to happen, they weren't having any of it. And they asked Jesus, should we strike with our swords? And it had to have been a rhetorical question, because anybody else run out ahead of Jesus sometimes? And Peter doesn't even wait for Jesus to answer. He just draws his sword and takes a swing at the high priest's servant. And you can imagine, if he cut off his ear, what was he probably aiming for? It was a good thing he was a bad shot, right? Cut off his ear. Jesus says, enough of this. I got a question up here. I didn't have time to deal with this in my last sermon. Thought I might take a stab at it this service. So why would Jesus tell his disciples just 2 hours earlier at the Last Supper to sell their coat and buy a sword and then not allow them to use it? I look back at verse 35. Here we go, 35. And Jesus he's talking about a time when he sent out the 72 to do ministry. This was earlier, perhaps a year or more earlier in Jesus' ministry. Verse 35, Jesus asked them, when I sent you without a purse, a bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. He said to them, from now on, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your coat and buy one. It was written, he was numbered with the transgressors. I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. So what's the difference? Is Jesus contradicting himself? Well, of course, the context of the command to buy a sword is in reference to the sending out of the 72 and the 12 on mission. And when Jesus sent them out during that time, Jesus' popularity was going crazy. Of course, the disciples would be welcomed. People would welcome their mission, welcome their message, because Jesus was popular at that time. What Jesus is saying is that from now on, from tonight on, things are going to change for you. There's going to be a huge change in how people will receive you as a messenger and a disciple of mine. Back then, you didn't have to bring provisions for the journey. No purse, no sandals, none of that stuff. You didn't have to bring that stuff because people wanted to help you. It's not going to be that way going forward. By telling them to buy a sword, Jesus is indicating that after his arrest and his execution, opinions about him are going to become even more polarizing. And the disciples' future mission will be met with hostility. In fact, so much so that they're not only going to need their own provisions, they're going to need their own protection too. A sword to deter those who are hostile from harming them. Jesus is not asking the disciples to defend him with force. This is clear because only 2 swords for 11 disciples, that's the end of the last section. He says, we got 2 swords, and Jesus says, that's enough. Well, 2 swords would hardly be enough for 11 guys to withstand an onslaught, an armed resistance against the establishment. And so Jesus' abrupt, hey, that's enough to their 2 swords is probably just his frustration. Probably frustration that I've been teaching these guys and teaching these guys and teaching these guys, and they're not getting it. They don't understand. Even in Jesus' arrest and his crucifixion, he lived out his teaching to love his enemies. And here, even the healing of the servant's ear is an example that Jesus not only taught, he lived what he taught. To love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who hate you and spitefully use you. And I think it is Jesus' time of prayer that has prepared him to surrender to God's plan in this moment. In contrast to the disciples' lack of prayer, I think that contributed to their not living out Jesus' teachings in the heat of the moment. And as Jesus is led away, the other Gospels say that all the disciples forsook Jesus and they fled, but Peter followed at a distance. Notice verse 54. And seizing him, they led him away, took him to the house of the high priest. And Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Surely this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean." The other Gospels say his accent betrayed where he was from. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And as he was speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you'll disown me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Here again, we see Peter, like a lot of us, overconfident and underprayed. Overconfident and underprayed. It's easy to tout Jesus among Christian friends in a living room. It's natural to draw a sword and defend his honor in our own strength and bravado. What isn't easy is to claim him humbly among hostile strangers. Paul reminds the church in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, the weapons we fight with are not the world's weapons. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. And the weaponry that Jesus employed in the garden was the weapon of prayer. Peter, in contrast, was still living relying on his fleshly weapons instead of following Jesus' lead. He's still living under the banner of our culture's mantra that if you work hard enough, anything is possible. That's what the American dream tells us. You can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And whether that's in sports or work or finances, you can do anything that you put your mind to if you're willing to do the hard work. You can win if you try hard enough. Well, it's a good thing Jesus has prayed for Peter, because Peter sure didn't prepare for this moment through his own prayers. In fact, if not for Jesus' prayer, Peter's denial may have been catastrophic. Satan in this moment is sifting Peter just like Jesus had prophesied, and Peter is failing miserably because he's relying not on God's resources but on his own. Peter fought in his own strength and lost. Jesus surrendered in prayer and won. The same is true for you and I. The contrast here between Jesus and Peter's response to testing could not be more stark. Peter fails with force. Jesus succeeds by surrender to God. This is absolutely countercultural. It is absolutely counterintuitive. It's against every fiber of everything your brain will be telling you to do. But the application for every one of us is the key to victory is what? Surrender. The key to victory is surrender. The world tells us that the key to victory is to fight harder. You've got to fight for your right to. You listened to the song too, didn't you? And that's the cultural mantra. You have to fight for what you want. Jesus shows us the key to victory is through surrender to God. The world tells us surrender is weakness. Jesus shows us here that there is great power in surrender if we surrender to the right person. There's victory in surrender. In fact, the greatest victory in the history of the world is won by Jesus in this moment through surrender. So what's your test of faith today? We're all battling something. What's the backpack you came in carrying? The one that's caused you to walk a little differently. You've been coping with that burden for a long time. What's your test of faith? What's your struggle? What's your challenge? I want to point out that if you're in recovery today, step number 3, the 12 steps of recovery, I put it on the screen behind me because it's so important, says what? We made a decision to turn our life and our what? Remember what I said your greatest battle will be? It's always against your self-will. But we have made a decision to turn our life and our will over to the control of who? To God. So even recovery says the way to overcome temptation and testing is not by fighting harder, it's by surrendering to the right one. Those 12 steps work. And the reason why is because a Christian wrote them and they're biblical. That's why they work. When we surrender our control to the Lord, this is true of every self-will that's in conflict with the divine will. You want to win the battle of the flesh? Surrender to the will of God in prayer. And I wish that it was a one and done deal. How many of you also, right? But it's not. It's in every morning you wake up, it's a new surrender to the will of God for that day. Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Remember the Lord's Prayer? The Lord's Prayer includes these words, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, in my life, as it is in heaven." Aaron's going to come up right now, and I'm going to offer an invitation this morning. I grew up riding horses. And sometime in the middle of my teen years, I switched from from horses to steel horses, motorcycles. Why did I do that? Because my steel horse never does anything I don't tell it to. If I get bucked off my steel horse, whose fault is it? Operator error. And there was plenty of those. It doesn't mean it can't hurt me, but it does mean that if I get hurt on my motorcycle, whose fault is it? It's mine. Nobody else's. You ever wondered why God didn't make us more like that? You know? Like a machine. Machines never do anything you don't tell them to. They don't. Horses are a different story. A very different story. And most of the time I've gotten into trouble on a horse, it was because the horse was doing its own thing, not my thing. Right? Trying to cross water on a horse that's afraid of water. You ever tried that? And the horse will get right up to the water, and I want it to go that way, across the water. And it goes that way, that way, that way, that way, right up until the time it's about to step into the water, and then it goes that way, over there. And somebody's going to hit the ground. And I'll give you a hint, it's not the horse. See, a good horse is in tune with the rider's will. It's in tune with the rider's will. You watch the cowboys and the rodeos, the pickup men. It's incredible. They'll be galloping alongside of a bucking horse, and some guy will dive off the side of the horse and grab onto the cowboy, and it'll get set safely on the ground. Or they'll take that horse and they'll round up the roping steers or the roping calves. And those horses, it's almost like they know what to do even without the rider. And that is exactly what God is calling us to be like. More often than not, I'm not like a good rodeo horse where I understand the will of the one whose plans should be controlling me. No, I'm more like a mule. And I'm stubborn, and I'm stupid, and I'm doing my own thing. But a good horse is in tune with the rider's will because of love. And here's the difference between steel horses and horses. Steel horses can't love you back. Now, sometimes I question if there's enough going on upstairs in a horse to be able to love you back either. But that's the difference. So why didn't God make us more like a machine? Because of love. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the nature of love is it requires this little pesky thing called free will. Free will. And God made us free will beings so that we could choose whether we wanted to operate on His plan or on our own plan. So when a horse loves you back, they show it through submission. The key to victory is surrender. This morning, we've got a prayer team over here. Our prayer sign fell down, but the team is still standing. That's a good thing. And we're going to stand and we're going to sing an invitation. And this morning, if you're in the Gethsemane of life, the olive press, you need prayer for any reason, they're there to pray with you. But maybe you're here today and you've never surrendered your life and your will to the control of our God. It's going to be a whole new world for you. But you have to take that step. Surrender your will. Because it is in that action right there, everything changes. We experience victory through surrender. Will you stand and sing this song? And if you want to make a decision for the first time to surrender your life to the Lord Jesus Christ, I'm going to be out at the Welcome Center right after service. I'd love to chat with you about that decision. Will you stand and sing with us?
And no to Jesus.